Welcome, everyone, to DEI After 5, the show that focuses on topics across diversity, equity, and inclusion with some of the brightest minds in the industry. Here's your hostess, inclusive culture curator, and coach, Sacha Thompson.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of DEI After 5. Okay, so if you have been paying any attention to what's been going on in the DEI space, you know that there's been a lot of pushback. We've been talking about it on the show for the last few episodes, and it's been in the news. It's just this anti-DEI effort, and so some of the impact of that has been some reluctance in the workplace, where we've had that before, but it seems to be a little bit different now, right? People seem to be speaking up a bit more about why are we doing this, or what's the purpose of this, or I don't think we should be doing it at all. And so I really wanted to spend a little bit of time talking to someone who is kind of in this space that has worked with how do you deal with some of that reluctance. And her name is Felicia Henderson. She is a European-based consultant that works with senior level executives. And so, Felicia, welcome to the show.
Sacha, thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here.
I'm excited about this conversation. So, Felicia, for folks who may not know who you are, or tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into this work.
Sure. Let me keep the story a little bit brief because it is a little bit wandering. I started my career as a Wall Street lawyer in New York, transferred to my firm's Paris office in 2001, and practiced for another 10 or so years and kind of burnt out on law, to be quite honest. I then had an opportunity to go into teaching and started teaching corporate law and governance, and quickly realized that the law, says some things and people are going to do others, and really started trying to understand why people act the way they do in organizations. I went and did a mid-career master's at INSEAD Business School here in France, and got connected to a wonderful professor, mentor. I have to shout her out, Zoe Kinias, who's now moved from INSEAD to Ivy Business School. But she and I began working, thinking about racial equity in organizations wasn't really something that people at INSEAD were doing. And through our collaboration, just got deeper into the space. And for the last, I would say, 5 years, have been working with large organizations, whether academic, corporations, and small organizations as well, and thinking about DEI strategy, inclusive leadership, and also providing some support to employee resource groups, typically Black leadership councils, some women's groups as well.
My curiosity just kind of jumped in. So when you're working with these organizations, are they mostly European based or global, kind of all over the spectrum?
Yeah, I would put them all. So let's say they're all over the spectrum, but my focus is typically on the European operations. So, for example, in December, I had the wonderful opportunity to do an offsite with the European leadership of a Japanese multinational, which, you're getting all kinds of cultures mixed in there. But yeah, my focus is typically, so I've worked with European organizations, I've worked with European subsidiaries, or, the business groups of American and other organizations.
So before we dive into the reluctance, I wanted to have this conversation because I think it's so important that we are talking about, and I'm air quoting my DEI, right? From a global context. How is it different in Europe? You touched on it a little bit, right? With saying, the racial disparities was not something that INSEAD or some of the other business schools or institutions were focused on. What are some of those differences that you're finding that are either unique to Europe or something that they're not necessarily even thinking about?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I have to say that it's evolving. But what I see frequently in Europe is, a, let's say, less maturity in some dimensions of diversity. Europe, I think, is great in looking and thinking about gender diversity, but anyone who's familiar with Europe knows that there are certain countries, like the one that I happen to sit in, that actually don't have racial data. So it's a little bit hard to think about racial equity when you actually don't know the starting point and you can't establish measurable objectives. There are other areas where I think Europe, again, is doing well, and where I feel like it's a little bit more sensitive. For example, religious discrimination, and I think you're seeing this in the U.S. unfortunately with we saw it post 9/11, and I think there may be a resurgence now. But Islamophobia is not necessarily recognized as a form of discrimination because there's this view that radical Islam is not a religion, or we don't understand the ways that we're actually stigmatizing all people of Arab origin, or basically treating them as a a potential terrorist. And so this sort of public safety concern seems to override, in some senses, the idea that there can actually be religious-based discrimination against people who are, of the Muslim faith.
Yeah.
I could go on. I think I would say one of the key differences, as I said, is this idea of maturity, and that includes within the community of practitioners as well. It's not as big a let's say industry here, and so finding sort of a community of practice has been a little bit of a challenge. Again, I want to shout out some people who are doing well in that space. A community of practice started by ANAR, which has been a wonderful opportunity to share both frustrations and avenues for progress.
Wonderful. And, I wanted us to kind of have that conversation because I think it's so important that people realize that how we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion in the United States is very different than other countries. And so that maturity level, their ideas of, exactly the example that you gave is very interesting to me, because I think so many people are trying to understand, well, why is this, an issue here, but not here? And what does that look like? And I remember when I worked in several organizations, actually, trying to do DEI work or have collaborations with folks that were in some of our other offices around even some of the wording of things, right? Because, when you mentioned France, and I remember very vividly talking to a colleague that said, oh, well, we don't have racial issues here. And I'm like, because you don't collect the data doesn't mean that you don't have racial issues, right? That's a nuance. And having that conversation, and I can't remember what it was something that had happened in the news recently in France during that time period. And I was just like, guess what? That's a racial issue that's happening in France. How does that impact, the work that you're doing or how people are showing up? And to your point, it wasn't even on the radar.
Right.
So I wanted us to have that part of the conversation, because I think that folks that are doing DEI work, especially in a global context, need to really understand that it looks very different. The understanding is very different. The dynamics are very different outside of the US context. And there's a level of frustration that everyone should be where the U.S. is, even though the U.S. isn't where the U.S. needs to be. So I appreciate that. So at the top of the show, I talked about this reluctance, and just in your conversation just now and kind of framing that, I think that is a level of reluctance, right? When people don't necessarily see or articulate things in the same way, at least in this U.S. context, there could be a little bit of pushback. There could be some hesitation. So talk to me about the work that you've been doing kind of in dealing with reluctance in this space and how to move this work forward.
Yeah. So, it's actually brilliant that you've sort of gotten curious about my global experience, because that is where my interest in reluctance came about. When I go into these spaces, people obviously hear my accent, so they know that I'm American, and I frequently encounter the refrain, "We're not the U.S." And I actually heard it so much that I decided to write an article about it. And, people can find that article. It's called Recognizing and Confronting Racism in Europe, where I talk about the reluctance, the various forms of reluctance that phrase means. And sometimes it is about what you've described, this attitude that people perceive amongst US-based DEI practitioners who don't have a global view, and that is that we can do DEI the same way everywhere. So I really started thinking about, how do I break down this idea of, we're not the United States, into its component parts. And that led me to, brainstorm and come up with a model. And I feel like such a nerd when I say that, but I guess I have to own my
You're with family, because I'm a big model nerd too.
Okay, yeah. And so I realized that there's reluctance that's based on lack of knowledge. And, we have research showing that people who are ignorant of a specific history, so a history of oppression within a particular country, will be unable to perceive present day systemic inequality. And so, one of the aspects of my model, the first L, the model is called local. And again, I love to shout out people who've inspired me. I have to talk about Stephanie Creary, who, she loves her models that are shaped around easy to remember words. So local is about helping people think about different parts of reluctance. So the L is for learn, and it really addresses this idea of ignorance. I don't think that you can be a good DEI practitioner without being a little bit of a historian, understanding what are the roots of the inequality that we're facing today. And so the next part of the model is observe. So the O is for observe. And that's, after I have this understanding of what happened in the past, I go out and I deliberately pay attention to what is happening today. And there are so many people who pass through the world and just don't see inequality because they aren't looking for it. But I think it became so stark during the pandemic shutdowns, the pandemic lockdowns. Who are the people who had to be out? And you can see the people who were in these service jobs. Who are the people who were most exposed to the virus, who didn't have, what is the word I'm looking for? Financial cushions. Yeah. And so you can begin to see these cracks in society. The pandemic made it very stark, but we can see them all the time if we just decide to look for them. The next part of local is C, and that is it's for contact or consult. And that means going out and talking to local groups or community groups who are typically working on these issues. I think in any country, you're going to find people who are organized around identity-based exclusion. And, sometimes we tag them as radicals or, they are marginalized. But most of these groups, they have a point. And they understand the local dynamics extraordinarily well. So I put the C after L and O because I don't want people going, we talk about the burden of educating others. And I don't want people going, I don't want people to turn up at a local community group and say, hey, teach me everything that's wrong with this country. This is the C is about going based on your own prior investigation and saying, help me deepen my understanding. This is what I see. I've talked a lot. I don't know if you want me to finish the.
Go for it. Cause I'm
Okay.
writing it down. My wheels are turning. Go for it.
Great. So then the A in local is for analyze. It can be analyze or assess. And that means where possible, getting quantitative data. So what is actually going on? The observe is really what you can perceive. The O is what you can perceive with your own, senses, with your own eyes and make sense of. The A is about really getting into the details. What quantitative data can I obtain? And then also combining that with your knowledge of history, with what you've observed, with your conversations, what I call qualitative data. And so, you get a much richer picture of what is actually going on in your society. And I had the chance to workshop the model with some of the top DEI academics in the US. And they pointed out that this is not just for geographies. It's something that you can do, within divisions in organizations.
Yep.
You can, begin to understand fault lines. And so it's really it's an analytical tool for understanding how we got to where we are and assessing where we are. And so then the final L for local is it's called link. And what are we linking? So I developed the model to help Europe-based DEI practitioners begin to localize or to adapt imperatives that they were receiving typically from their US headquarters. And so instead of them just saying, we're not the US, they were able to say, these are the ways that inequality is showing up in our context. And so we understand that our head office wants us to, pursue this objective, to, improve gender balance or to improve racial equity or to, decrease disability-based exclusion. So yeah, that's the model, LOCAL.
I love it. And I appreciate starting with that learn, because I always say, like, any practitioner needs to be a forever student. You're constantly learning, you're constantly evolving, you're constantly doing something to educate yourself in this space. And so starting there and then sitting back and observing, right? Like, this is not about saviorism. And I think so many people kind of go into this work thinking that, I'm going to be the savior, I'm going to fix it. You can't necessarily fix it if you don't understand, again, the historical context, understand some of the other local challenges that people are facing. And so I love this model because it really does force you to sit back and really think about, okay, how do we make this work? Right now that I kind of see all of the pieces and understand from global context, the big office is saying this, or government is saying this, how does this now, what is the impact that this has?
Yeah. So I
love it.
always say, as I said, I was a lawyer for a few years of my life, for a dozen years of my life. And my approach is always, you can't solve the problem if you don't ask the right question.
Right.
And so DEI to me is not a one size fits all. It cannot be.
Yeah.
And it's also not a one shot. So we're, constantly, as you said, constantly learning. And local for me is really, I sometimes describe it as an iterative model because, or an iterative framework. It's not linear. So sometimes you go and you have a conversation with people, the local organizations, and they give you a completely different perspective on something. And so there's another book that you need to read, and then you deepen your knowledge, and so it's, you're constantly growing.
Yeah.
And I really, I don't like to pat myself on the back, but it just,
take it, pat yourself.
Well, I mean, it seemed just, it was like a flash. I was just like, wow, these are all the questions that I think people need to be asking. And here's maybe a simpler framework for people to, begin to organize their thinking. And like you said, take that step back. Don't just parachute in and say, here's what we're going to do.
Yeah. And I appreciate it because oftentimes I encounter, and I'll just put it this way, I encounter people that have this very particular mindset, right? And I'm kind of tying this back to that reluctancy, but like this mindset of this is what this is. And so what I love to do is kind of sit back, like, let me ask some questions, because what I'm hearing is something that's very different than what you are articulating. And I think once you can start to unpack some of that reluctance, you realize, okay, this isn't necessarily reluctant. I'll give this example. Having this whole conversation on LinkedIn, and, it was someone that said that they did not necessarily believe in inclusion, right? That people that come to the United States need to have, American ideals and, all of these things, and they need to be flying the American flag. And we started to unpack. I was like, I'm curious, right? Like, ask a bunch of questions. And what I ended up leading him toward was, so what I'm hearing is your expectations of them are not aligned with what you would do, right? Because they're not showing Americanness in the way that you would. And so therefore they're not American, and therefore, all of these things. So your issue isn't with inclusion. Your issue is with a misalignment of expectations, beliefs, and behaviors. Very different.
Yeah.
Right. And so when I hear a model like this, it forces you to ask the right questions. And maybe that's the coach in me. But it forces you to ask the right questions to get to the root of the issue, so that you can come up with solutions that are not just superficial. Like, you're now coming up with solutions that are grounded in, okay, what is the actual issue here?
Yeah.
Right? Because let's solve for that versus just putting lipstick on a pig.
Yeah. And let me, so one thing that I did not mention, and, so coming back to this idea of reluctance, I mentioned this idea of, the what's called the Marley hypothesis. If you knew your history, then you would know where I'm coming from. So that point of the historical ignorance. But then there are aspects of reluctance that relate to, what we call identity threat or identity protection. This preservation of ourselves, and here I'm talking about people in the majority, whatever that majority is, whether it's racial, gender, sexual orientation, etc. This idea that that our group are belonging to a particular group isn't really that meaningful to our experience. And so we know, for example, that, when you are swimming in the water or when you're swimming with the current, you don't notice that you're actually, getting propulsed forward. But when someone sort of steps back and says, "Hey, actually, here's how race impacts my life," or "Here's how gender impacts my life," then you can begin to understand these dimensions that that don't seem particularly important to us, or aren't particularly important to us as an individual. And one of the things that local does is really it helps people to begin to think about how these, again, step outside of our own perspective and observe what's going on, have conversations with other people. And leaping back to what you just said, a third aspect of reluctance is this firm belief in meritocracy. This firm belief, and this is in most Western countries, and unfortunately exported by American exceptionalism. This belief that the market always wins, that or the market, the wisdom of the market is perfect, and we're always selecting the best without ever stepping back to understand the self-serving ways that merit is defined and the ways that merit sort of is essentially a tool for perpetuating bias. But because we have this idealization of meritocracy, we cannot accept any story that says, "I got this not because of merit." And so when in the assess or analyze part of local, we're not just looking at the dynamics, the inequality dynamics or the dynamics of exclusion. We're also looking at the dynamics of reluctance. So what are the stories that people are telling themselves about why we don't need DEI? And that story that you're, I don't know who you were talking to, but the person that you mentioned, that's one of the narratives that we have to, we have to be aware of. So what are the stories that people are telling themselves about why we don't need this? And that then again allows us to construct counter narratives or unpack what's really at the root of this reluctance, to really be able to address it more skillfully and directly.
This work is, and I say this to everyone, like, this work is hard. This work is not easy on who we are as individuals. And if you are like me, like, my brain is constantly going. So when I hear models, when I hear like other parts of research, I'm always just like, ooh, okay, let me go learn more about that. Like, literally, I have a book that someone mentioned to me the other day, right? Non-Western perspectives of learning and knowing.
Wow.
Right. And I'm just like, ooh, let me dive into that, because I think that's how we talk about, decolonizing our mind, but no one talks about what that looks like. So let me see what that looks like. So that's just the nerd in me.
Yeah.
And so again, as an academic, how do you turn your brain off? Like, what are the things that you do to kind of relax and take care of yourself and fill your cup and slow the brain down?
Oh, yeah. I mean, let me just confess that I'm not always very good at it. I think if we're being perfectly candid, that I do get to the point of I don't want to say burnout, because I somehow keep going, but I do get frazzled. And so I could be better at this self-care component. And so what I do constantly is I do morning meditation. I have an app where I do at least 10 minutes of meditation. I have started, or restarted, I should say, doing yoga. Just a few sun salutations, nothing fancy, in the morning. And that way I get my day started with just, being in a quiet space. when the day is going a little bit too crazy, well, one thing that I do is I don't let my days get too crazy anymore. I was a practicing lawyer for 12 and a half years, and my days were filled, and every minute was accounted for. I have said to myself, never again. So I actually build breaks into my day. And, it may be that I'm staring out a window. It may be that I live in Paris, so I may just, walk out and look at some of the beautiful architecture, sit in a park, have a coffee. And I have learned the enormous power of no.
Yes.
I
No,
do
yes.
not, I don't overschedule anymore. And that, so, I know that my brain is going to spin out, but there's a wonderful thing in one of my meditations where it says, let your brain, it's like, as you do with, dog on its daily walk, you may let it go off leash and, do what it wants. And so, there are those moments where you just, okay, I'm not forcing my brain to focus on anything. I'm not forcing it to be quiet, just letting it do whatever it's going to do. And so, those brain breaks where it just, it exercises itself really helped me at the end of the day. I was texting with some friends the other day, and I was like, I have suddenly become a champion sleeper, and I don't know what it is, but I really think it is just letting your brain, run a little bit wild during the day, and then it's ready to quiet down at the end of the day.
I need to try that because sleep is not my friend. So.
Oh no.
But no, Felicia, thank you so much. Like, I truly appreciate that, because sometimes it is just, sitting and looking out the window and, just not doing anything is doing something. Mm-hmm. So I appreciate you sharing that. If people wanted to get in contact with you, what is the best way for them to do that?
So I think I've shared my email with you. People are welcome to contact me via email. I am on LinkedIn, and so people can find me there, and we can take it from there if they have deeper questions.
Wonderful. Felicia, thank you so much for joining me today. I really, really enjoyed this conversation.
It was my pleasure, Sacha. Thank you so much again for the invitation.
Absolutely. And thank you all for watching this week's or listening to this week's episode of DEI After 5. I hope you were able to walk away with a few nuggets, even if it is this local, and to help you think through how to start connecting some of those things that you're doing and deal with that reluctance in ways where you're asking the right questions and really engaging in ways that you probably haven't before. So thank you again. You can find us here every Tuesday at 5:15 p.m. Eastern. Be sure to like, share, subscribe. Tell me what you're thinking about these episodes. I would love to hear from you. And until next time, have a good one.